Part 1. The Whispers of Forgotten Resonance. We stand on the precipice of understanding, gazing across the vast expanse of human history, searching for answers etched not in stone, but perhaps in the very air itself. For millennia, we've marveled at the monumental achievements of ancient civilizations. The pyramids of Giza, the towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the intricate stonework of Machu Picchu, structures so colossal, so precisely constructed, they defy easy explanation. We've attributed their creation to ingenuity, to back-breaking labor, to the sheer force of human will. But what if there was something more? What if, hidden within the forgotten lore of these vanished cultures, lies a secret that rewrites our understanding of their capabilities, a secret whispered on the wind, carried on the vibrations of sound itself, the power to manipulate matter with acoustic resonance. It's a concept that borders on the fantastical, a realm often relegated to myth and legend. Yet, within the realm of physics, we find tantalizing hints, echoes of a forgotten science that may have been wielded by our ancestors. Consider the phenomenon of cymatics, the visualization of sound waves. Simple experiments reveal how sound can organize particles into intricate patterns, shaping and reshaping matter with invisible forces. We see it in the delicate dance of sand on a vibrating plate, forming complex geometries in response to different frequencies. Could this principle, amplified on a monumental scale, have been the key to moving the massive stones that form the foundation of ancient wonders? The sheer scale of these constructions begs the question: how did they do it? Conventional explanations, while plausible, often strain under the weight of logistical challenges. Transporting multi-ton blocks of stone across vast distances, lifting them into precise positions with rudimentary tools. The sheer manpower required seems almost insurmountable. And yet, there they stand, testaments to an undeniable achievement. Could it be that we've overlooked a crucial element, a forgotten force harnessed by ancient engineers? The idea of sonic levitation isn't entirely foreign to modern science. Acoustic levitation, though currently limited to small objects, demonstrates the potential of sound to defy gravity. Researchers have successfully levitated droplets of liquid, small spheres, even insects, using carefully controlled acoustic fields. If we can achieve this on a small scale today, could a more advanced understanding of acoustics have enabled ancient civilizations to manipulate objects on a far grander scale? The possibility, however remote, is too intriguing to dismiss. Ancient texts, often dismissed as allegorical or symbolic, may hold clues to this lost science. References to chanting, to specific musical tones, to the voice of the gods, resonating through the land. Could these be more than poetic metaphors? Could they be veiled descriptions of sophisticated acoustic techniques used to manipulate and move massive objects? Consider the Tibetan monks and their legendary ability to levitate heavy stones using sound, a feat witnessed by numerous travelers throughout history, though often met with skepticism. Could this be a surviving remnant of a once widespread knowledge, a faint echo of a forgotten technology? The very architecture of ancient sites may itself hold clues. The precise placement of stones, the resonant chambers found within pyramids and temples, the intricate carvings and geometric patterns adorning their walls. Could these elements have played a role in harnessing and directing acoustic energy? Could the structures themselves have been designed as giant resonators, amplifying and focusing sound waves to achieve incredible feats of engineering? We are only beginning to scratch the surface of this fascinating possibility. The evidence, while circumstantial, is compelling enough to warrant further investigation. Perhaps the whispers of this forgotten resonance still linger in the air, waiting to be deciphered. Perhaps the stones themselves hold the memory of the sounds that shaped them, waiting for us to rediscover the lost science of acoustic levitation. The journey to uncover this hidden history will be long and arduous, filled with skepticism and challenges. But the potential rewards, a paradigm shift in our understanding of ancient civilizations and their capabilities, are too significant to ignore. We must listen closely, not just to the echoes of the past, but to the whispers of a future built on the rediscovery of ancient wisdom. The silence after the tremor was more unnerving than the rumbling itself. Dust, fine as powdered bone, drifted down from the unseen ceiling of the cavern, catching in the beams of our headlamps. Elena, her face pale and drawn, clutched the sonic resonators tighter. I could feel the vibrations still humming through the rock. A phantom echo of the ancient technology we'd just activated. Did we move it? Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse. I shone my lamp towards the far end of the cavern, where the massive stone door, etched with incomprehensible symbols, had stood for millennia. It was still there, a monolithic slab of obsidian, seemingly untouched. But something felt off. I don't know, I admitted, my stomach churning. The air, already thick with the musty scent of ages, now carried a new undercurrent, something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. Elena, ever the pragmatist, began adjusting the dials on her resonator. Let's try a different frequency, she muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. The inscriptions suggest a sequence. We might need to find the right harmonic resonance. I watched her, a knot of unease tightening in my chest. This whole expedition had felt wrong from the start. Deciphering the sonic blueprints of a civilization that vanished without a trace, using their technology to manipulate forces we barely understood. It felt like tempting fate, like playing with a power that was beyond our control. As Elena tweaked the dials, a low hum began to emanate from the resonators, a deep, pulsating drone that vibrated through the very bones of the cavern. The dust particles in the air began to dance, forming intricate patterns that shifted and swirled with the changing frequency. Then, the humming intensified. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The ground trembled beneath our feet, not with the rumbling force of before, but with a high-pitched vibration that seemed to penetrate every cell in my body. And then, the door began to move, not with a grinding scrape of stone on stone, but with an unnerving silence. It simply shifted, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around it. A sliver of darkness appeared along its edge, widening into a gaping maw that seemed to swallow the light from our headlamps. Elena, stop, I yelled, the sound swallowed by the oppressive hum. But she seemed oblivious, her eyes fixed on the moving door, a strange, almost hypnotic fascination in her gaze. The opening widened, revealing not the expected passage beyond, but an impenetrable void, a swirling blackness that seemed to suck the air from the cavern. A chilling wind, laced with the same metallic scent, whipped out from the darkness, extinguishing our headlamps and plunging us into absolute blackness. Panic clawed at my throat. I stumbled back, reaching out blindly, my hand brushing against something cold and smooth. It was Elena's arm. I grabbed her, pulling her away from the abyss. Elena, we need to get out of here, I shouted, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Her body was rigid, her hand still gripping the resonator, the low hum still vibrating through her fingers. I pulled harder, dragging her away from the opening, but she remained unresponsive, her eyes fixed on the darkness as if she were entranced. Finally, with a desperate heave, I managed to pull her free. The humming from the resonators began to fade, the swirling darkness within the doorway contracting, shrinking back into the impossibly smooth surface of the stone door. The silence that followed was deafening. I fumbled for my lighter, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the cavern walls. Elena stood beside me, her eyes vacant, her breathing shallow. Elena, are you all right? I asked, my voice shaking. She blinked, as if waking from a dream. I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I saw something. What did you see? She shook her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. I can't explain it. It wasn't of this world. I looked back at the door, its surface now smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. But I knew. We had opened something ancient and powerful, something that had been sealed away for millennia. And whatever it was, it had noticed us. The metallic scent lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the darkness we had unleashed. We were no longer just explorers. We were intruders, and something was waiting, just on the other side of that silent stone door. Waiting for us to make another mistake. The humming intensified. It was no longer a distant thrum but a physical presence, vibrating the very marrow in my bones. The air itself seemed to thicken, shimmering with an unseen energy. Elena's grip on my arm tightened. Her face, illuminated by the flickering lantern, was a mask of terror. We pressed ourselves against the cold, damp wall of the chasm, desperately seeking a refuge that wasn't there. Above, the sky, previously a canvas of star-dusted darkness, began to swirl with unnatural colors. Veins of pulsating green and violet light pulsed across the celestial dome, mimicking the rhythm of the humming. The unsettling spectacle felt like watching the internal organs of some cosmic behemoth exposed. "It's the resonators," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing drone. "They're activating." I knew what she meant. The ancient texts we'd studied, the very ones that had led us to this cursed place, spoke of resonators, massive crystalline structures strategically placed to amplify and direct the sonic energies used to manipulate the Earth. We had dismissed them as fanciful embellishments, metaphorical descriptions of unknown technologies. Now, we were witnessing their horrifying reality. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Small pebbles danced and skittered across the uneven surface. The humming climbed another octave, morphing into a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. We continued our descent, clinging precariously to the rough-hewn steps carved into the chasm wall. The air grew colder, and a strange, metallic scent permeated the air. It smelled like blood, but colder, more inorganic. We reached a plateau, a small, flat area carved into the side of the chasm. Here, the source of the unsettling metallic odor became horrifyingly clear. Etched into the rock face, barely visible in the flickering lantern light, were intricate carvings. They depicted grotesque, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and distorted features. But it wasn't the carvings themselves that made my blood run cold. It was the substance filling the grooves. A viscous, dark red fluid, shimmering with an oily sheen, pulsed sluggishly within the carvings, its rhythm synchronized with the omnipresent hum. It's like the resonators are bleeding," Elena stammered, her voice thick with revulsion. As we watched, horrified, the fluid in the carvings began to glow. The humming intensified again, reaching a deafening crescendo. The ground shook violently, and cracks spider-webbed across the rock face. A low, rumbling groan echoed through the chasm, as if the earth itself were crying out in pain. Then, the mountain moved. Not in a dramatic, earth-shattering way, but with a slow, deliberate grinding that was somehow even more terrifying. The walls of the chasm seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythmic pulsing of the resonators. The carvings on the wall glowed with an infernal light, the dark red fluid within them flowing faster, as if fueled by the mountain's agonizing movements. We clung to each other, paralyzed by fear. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The metallic smell intensified, chokingly thick. The humming, the groaning, the grinding of rock, it all coalesced into a symphony of dread that threatened to shatter our sanity. Suddenly, the humming ceased. The groaning stopped. The grinding of rock faded into an unsettling silence. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of our hearts. The eerie silence lasted only a moment. Then, a new sound emerged, a sound that chilled me to the core. It was a whisper, faint at first, then growing louder, closer. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a disembodied voice echoing through the chasm. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, a language that sounded both ancient and alien. The syllables were guttural, clicking, and filled with a chilling resonance that seemed to vibrate within my skull. Elena's eyes were wide with terror. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I understand it," she whispered, her voice trembling. What is it saying?" I demanded, my voice strained. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the chasm as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Then, she spoke, her voice barely a breath. It's welcoming us. It's saying, we have awakened it." The whispering intensified, becoming a chorus of disembodied voices. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble again, this time with a new, more purposeful rhythm. The mountain was not just moving. It was waking up, and whatever it was, whatever had lain dormant beneath the earth for eons, was not pleased to be disturbed. The carvings on the wall pulsed with a renewed vigor, the dark red fluid within them flowing rapidly, as if in anticipation. And in the heart of that fluid, something moved. Something shifted. Something opened. We were trapped. Trapped in a chasm with a waking mountain and something ancient and malevolent stirring within its depths. And the welcoming whisper was becoming a roar. The glyphs pulsed, a faint thrumming vibration resonating through the stone floor, up through Alina's boots, and into her bones. The air shimmered around the central altar, a distortion like heat rising off asphalt, only colder, somehow, sucking the warmth from the chamber. Marco, pale and sweating, clutched his notebook, his frantic scribbling the only sound besides the unsettling hum. It's getting louder, he whispered, his voice strained. He looked up at Elena, eyes wide and frantic. We need to go, now. Elena hesitated. The allure of the unknown, the tantalizing possibility of unlocking a power lost for millennia, warred with the primal fear coiling in her gut. She knew Marco was right, that this place radiated an unnatural energy that felt increasingly hostile, yet she couldn't tear herself away. Just a little longer, she pleaded, her voice barely a breath. We need to understand this. As if in response, the humming intensified, morphing into a low drone that vibrated the very air around them. Dust particles danced in the newly strengthened shimmer, forming swirling patterns that mimicked the glyphs on the altar. The temperature plummeted, and Elena saw her breath puff out in white clouds. Suddenly, the ground lurched. A low groan echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant, like the earth itself complaining under a heavy burden. Marco yelped and stumbled, grabbing Elena's arm for support. What was that? He stammered, his voice tight with terror. Another groan, louder this time, followed by a series of sharp cracks echoing from the depths of the mountain. The ground trembled again, sending tremors through their bodies. Elena felt a sickening sense of vertigo, as if the world was tilting beneath their feet. The glyphs on the altar glowed brighter, pulsating with an almost blinding intensity. We have to get out. Elena shouted over the growing cacophony. She grabbed Marco's hand and pulled him towards the tunnel. They stumbled through the darkness, the ground shaking violently beneath them. The droning sound had escalated into a deafening roar, punctuated by the sickening crunch of rock grinding against rock. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something acrid and metallic, like blood. As they reached the entrance to the tunnel, a massive tremor threw them to the ground. Elena hit her head hard against the stone floor, a sharp pain lancing through her skull. She looked up, dazed, to see the entrance collapsing, rocks tumbling down to block their escape. Trapped. Panic clawed at Elena's throat. The roar continued, resonating through the mountain, growing in intensity. The ground bucked and swayed, making it difficult to stand. Marco scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of terror. We're going to die in here, he screamed, his voice lost in the deafening roar. Elena struggled to her feet, her head throbbing. She knew Marco was right. They were trapped in the heart of the mountain, at the mercy of a force they couldn't comprehend. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, a flicker of understanding ignited in her mind. The glyphs, the sounds, the tremors, it wasn't just the mountain groaning. It was something else, something vast and ancient, awakening. The resonating sound intensified further, shifting into a complex symphony of tones, high-pitched whistles intertwining with guttural groans, a chorus of unearthly voices rising from the depths of the earth. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the shimmering around the altar intensifying, spreading across the chamber like the living thing. Suddenly, the floor beneath them vanished. Elena and Marco plunged into darkness, falling into a seemingly bottomless chasm. The roar of the mountain filled their ears, a deafening prelude to what awaited them below. Elena caught a glimpse of something enormous moving in the darkness, something vast and shadowy, its form shifting and swirling in the shimmering light. It emitted a low, resonant hum, a sound that resonated deep within her bones, a sound that spoke of unimaginable power and ancient, unknowable horrors. The last thing Elena saw before darkness consumed her was the shape of the mountain above, splitting apart, revealing a gaping maw against the starlit sky. The sound that followed was not the rumble of collapsing rock, but a deep, guttural sigh, as if the earth itself was exhaling after millennia of slumber. And within that sigh, Elena heard a whisper, a single word echoing through the void, a word that chilled her to the core. Awake. Asterisk. What if ancient civilizations used sound to move mountains? Part 5. The silence after the tremor was thicker than the dust that coated everything. It pressed against my eardrums, a physical presence. Elena, pale and trembling, clutched my arm. Did you hear that humming? She whispered, her voice thin and reedy. I had. A deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but in my bones. It had started subtly, a low background hum like a distant generator, but had risen to a crescendo just before the ground shook. Now, only the unsettling silence remained. We moved cautiously through the ruined city, the air heavy with the scent of pulverized stone and something else, something metallic and acrid, like the smell of burnt ozone. The sun, a hazy orange disk through the dust clouds, cast long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed with every gust of wind. Each crumbling building seemed to watch us with hollow, empty eyes. We found Professor Armitage by the central amphitheater, his face a mask of horrified fascination. He was hunched over a large, flat stone, tracing the intricate carvings with a trembling finger. The resonance, he muttered, his voice hoarse. They amplified it, focused it, incredible. Professor, are you all right? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. He looked up, his eyes wide and unfocused. All right? This changes everything. Everything we thought we knew about these people, about history itself. He trailed off, his gaze returning to the stone. The carvings, I saw, were unlike anything we'd encountered before. They weren't depictions of gods or animals, but complex geometric patterns, spirals within spirals, radiating outwards like ripples in a pond. Cymatic patterns, Elena breathed, her eyes widening. Like the shapes sound creates in sand or water. Armitage nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Precisely. They understood the very fabric of sound, the way it can shape and manipulate matter. These patterns, they're the key. The blueprint for controlling the resonance. The ground trembled again, a low rumble that quickly escalated into a violent shudder. We stumbled, grabbing onto each other for support. This time, the humming returned, deeper and more insistent, resonating through the very ground beneath our feet. We followed Armitage's frantic gestures towards a partially collapsed structure that looked like it might have once been a temple. Inside, shielded from the worst of the tremors, we found what he'd been searching for. A chamber filled with enormous, bell-like structures made of a dark, metallic material we couldn't identify. They were arranged in a circle, each one a different size and shape, their surfaces covered in the same intricate cymatic patterns we'd seen on the stone. The resonators, Armitage whispered, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of awe and terror. This is how they did it. This is how they moved mountains. As the humming intensified, the resonators began to vibrate, a low, guttural thrum that seemed to shake the very foundations of the temple. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and cracks spider-webbed across the walls. The air crackled with an unseen energy. Suddenly, one of the resonators, a massive, bell-shaped structure at the center of the circle, began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. The humming rose to a deafening roar, and the ground beneath us bucked and heaved. The other resonators joined in, their metallic surfaces vibrating with increasing intensity, their glow growing brighter and brighter. We covered our ears, the sound unbearable, the vibrations shaking us to our core. Through the cacophony, I heard Armitage shouting something, but his words were lost in the roar. He gestured wildly towards the resonators, his eyes wide with a manic energy. Then, the unthinkable happened. The ground beneath the central resonator began to liquefy, turning into a swirling vortex of dust and debris. The resonator itself, glowing with an almost blinding light, began to sink into the earth, as if swallowed by some monstrous, unseen maw. Panic seized us. We turned to flee, but the entrance to the chamber had collapsed, blocking our escape. We were trapped, the deafening roar of the resonators filling the air, the ground shaking violently beneath our feet. As the central resonator disappeared completely into the earth, the other resonators began to follow, one by one, sinking into the swirling vortex. The humming, mercifully, began to fade, replaced by a low, rumbling groan that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. The ground beneath us stabilized, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the cacophony that had preceded it. We were trapped in the ruins of the temple, surrounded by the remnants of a technology we could barely comprehend, a technology that had the power to reshape the world, and perhaps, to destroy it. And in the unsettling silence, I could have sworn I heard another sound, faint and distant, but growing steadily louder, the sound of something vast and powerful stirring beneath the earth. What if ancient civilizations used sound to move mountains? Part 6 of 25. The silence that followed Alara's scream was more terrifying than any sound. The resonating hum had ceased, leaving a vacuum in the air, a tangible absence that pressed against our eardrums. Dust motes, disturbed by the sonic vibrations, still danced in the beams of our headlamps, creating a ghostly ballet in the cavernous space. I fumbled for Alara's hand, my own shaking uncontrollably. She didn't respond. "Alara?" I whispered, my voice thin and reedy. No answer. Slowly, hesitantly, I turned the beam of my headlamp towards where she had been standing, towards the obsidian monolith. She was gone. Vanished. The smooth, black surface of the monolith gleamed, reflecting the light back at me with an unnerving intensity. There was no sign of a struggle, no trace of her presence. It was as though she had simply dissolved into the air. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I spun around, searching the vast chamber, desperately hoping she had somehow stumbled away in the darkness. "Alara!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the chamber, bouncing off the unseen walls. The only response was the hollow whisper of the echoes, a mocking reminder of her absence. Professor Armitage, his face ashen, moved towards the monolith, his hand outstretched as if to touch it. I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I hissed, a primal fear gripping me. "We don't know what happened." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and scientific curiosity. "But, where did she go?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. We searched the chamber for hours, our initial panic slowly giving way to a chilling despair. There was no trace of Alara. She had simply disappeared. The resonating hum, the strange symbols, the vanishing, it all pointed to something beyond our comprehension, something terrifyingly alien. We returned to the campsite, defeated and broken. The cheerful crackle of the fire now seemed a cruel mockery of our despair. David paced restlessly, his face etched with worry. He hadn't witnessed Alara's disappearance, and the explanation I offered sounded more like a desperate delusion than a factual account. "Gone?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "Just, gone?" I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. The image of Alara vanishing into thin air was burned into my mind, a horrifying loop playing on repeat. Professor Armitage sat hunched by the fire, staring into the flames, his face a mask of grim contemplation. He muttered to himself, phrases I couldn't quite catch, fragments of ancient languages, scientific theories, and desperate prayers all jumbled together. He was lost in his own world, grappling with the impossible. As the night wore on, a chilling theory began to form in my mind. The resonating hum, the vanishing, what if the monolith wasn't just moving mountains? What if it was moving people? What if it was some kind of ancient transportation device, a portal to another dimension, another time? The thought was so outlandish, so unbelievable, that I almost dismissed it. But what other explanation was there? Alara hadn't just walked away. She had vanished. And the monolith was the only thing that had changed, the only anomaly in the entire chamber. The next morning, Professor Armitage announced his decision. We were going back to the chamber. He was determined to find out what had happened to Alara, even if it meant risking his own life. David and I, despite our fear, agreed. We couldn't just leave her there, wherever there was. We returned to the chamber, armed with more powerful lights and a sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. The silence in the chamber was even more profound than before, a suffocating blanket of stillness. The obsidian monolith stood in the center of the chamber, its smooth surface gleaming malevolently in the light of our lamps. Professor Armitage approached the monolith cautiously, his eyes scanning its surface for any clue, any sign of what had happened to Alara. He ran his hand over the smooth, cold stone, his fingers tracing the strange symbols etched into its surface. Suddenly, he stopped, his hand hovering over a particular symbol, a complex pattern of interlocking circles and lines. "This," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This symbol, I've seen it before." He pulled a worn leather-bound notebook from his bag and flipped through the pages, his fingers stained with ink and dust. He stopped at a page filled with sketches and notes, his eyes fixed on a particular drawing. "It's a glyph," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A glyph representing transference." He looked up at us, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. "This monolith, it's not just a tool for moving mountains. It's a gateway to somewhere else." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Alara, she hadn't just vanished. She had been transported. But to where? And how could we possibly bring her back? The silence in the chamber deepened, broken only by the frantic beating of our hearts. The monolith stood before us, a silent testament to the power of a civilization lost to time, a gateway to the unknown, and a chilling reminder of the price of our curiosity. What if ancient civilizations used sound to move mountains? Part 7. The cavern floor pulsed with a low hum, a vibration that climbed from the soles of my boots, through my legs, and settled uneasily in my stomach. Dr. Menard, his face illuminated by the swinging beam of his headlamp, traced the glyphs with a trembling finger. He muttered something in a language I didn't recognize, a guttural series of clicks and hisses that echoed unnaturally in the vast space. "What is it?" I asked, my voice a strained whisper. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. It was more than just the confined space, it felt expectant. Menard didn't answer. He continued his tracing, his finger following the grooves of the carvings with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The hum intensified, resonating now within my very bones. I could feel the rock around us thrumming, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to grow with every passing second. "Dr. Menard," I repeated, my voice laced with a growing unease. "We need to leave, now." He finally looked up, his eyes wide and unfocused, pupils dilated in the flickering lamplight. This is the key," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The resonant frequency, the one they used." "Used for what?" I pressed, my hand instinctively reaching for the small, antiquated pistol tucked into my waistband. It felt ridiculously inadequate against the immensity of the cavern and the palpable sense of dread that permeated the air. "To reshape the world," Menard breathed, his gaze fixed on the glyphs. "To move mountains. To awaken." A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the cavern, followed by a shower of dust and pebbles. A fissure, thin as a hair, snaked its way across the wall, pulsing with a faint, orange light. The hum deepened, morphing into a low, guttural groan. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't an earthquake. It was something else. Something orchestrated. Menard, oblivious to my mounting terror, began to chant. The same clicks and hisses I had heard before, now amplified, resonating with the growing hum of the cavern. The fissure widened, the orange glow intensifying, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. "Stop," I yelled, grabbing his arm. "You don't know what you're doing." He shrugged me off, his eyes glazed over, lost in a fervor I couldn't comprehend. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, merging with the deep, resonating hum into a single, overwhelming wave of sound. The ground beneath our feet trembled violently. More fissures appeared, spider webbing across the walls, pulsing with that unsettling orange light. The air crackled with static. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that something was about to happen. Something catastrophic. Then, from the depths of the earth, a sound arose. A sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was a deep, resonating bellow, filled with an ancient, unimaginable power. It wasn't just heard, it was felt. It vibrated through every fiber of my being, a primal scream that echoed across millennia. The cavern walls began to buckle. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. The orange glow from the fissures intensified, blindingly bright now, casting the cavern in an infernal light. The ground heaved beneath us, throwing me off my feet. I scrambled for purchase, my fingers scraping against the rough stone. Menard continued to chant, his voice a thin, reedy thread against the overwhelming roar that filled the cavern. He was smiling, a beatific expression on his face, as if witnessing the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. With a startled cry, he disappeared into the widening chasm, swallowed by the earth. The chanting ceased abruptly. The resonating bellow, however, continued, growing louder, more intense, as if fueled by Menard's sacrifice. I crawled towards the edge of the chasm, peering into the darkness. The orange glow emanated from the depths, illuminating a swirling vortex of dust and rock. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and something else, something ancient and indescribably foul. The bellow intensified, reaching a crescendo that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The ground bucked and swayed. The entire cavern felt as if it was about to implode. I knew I had to get out. Now, turning, I scrambled back the way we had come, stumbling through the darkness, the terrifying bellow echoing in my ears. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, a labyrinth designed to trap and confuse. Finally, I saw the faint glimmer of daylight ahead. Hope surged through me, a desperate flicker in the face of overwhelming dread. I pushed myself forward, running now, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. As I stumbled out of the tunnel and into the blinding sunlight, I glanced back. The mountain, once a solid, imposing presence, was now shrouded in a swirling cloud of dust and debris. The resonating bellow continued, unabated, a chilling testament to the power unleashed from the depths of the earth. And then, with a final, earth-shattering roar, the mountain began to move. The silence after the tremor was more unsettling than the rumbling itself. Dust motes danced in the single, flickering gas lamp, illuminating Alara's stricken face. She pressed her hand against the cold stone wall, as if seeking reassurance from its solidity. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rush of blood in my ears. "It wasn't an earthquake," I said, though the conviction in my voice was feigned. Earthquakes didn't come in rhythmic pulses, like a giant's heartbeat. Earthquakes didn't make the air hum with an almost imperceptible vibration. We were deep within the bowels of the ziggurat, following the spiraling tunnel downwards, its rough-hewn walls covered in indecipherable carvings. The air was thick and stale, tasting of dust and something older, something primal. Each step deeper felt like a descent into a forgotten age, an age where the boundaries between the physical and the ethereal were blurred. Alara clutched the journal tighter, her knuckles white. "My grandfather, he warned me about this. He said the mountain, it listens." "Listens?" I scoffed, though a shiver crawled down my spine. He said the ancients used sound not just to move stones, but to communicate with something else. The flickering lamplight cast elongated shadows that danced and writhed, mimicking the carvings on the walls. They seemed to shift and change before my eyes, depicting strange, elongated figures with hollow eyes and too many limbs. I blinked, and they solidified back into their original, albeit unnerving, forms. We pressed on, the silence broken only by the scrape of our boots against the stone and our shallow breaths. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. Then, we heard it. A faint, low hum that resonated deep within our chests. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, but felt with your bones. "It's starting," Alara whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The humming intensified, growing louder, more insistent. The air vibrated with an unseen energy. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble again, this time with a more pronounced rhythm. The carvings on the walls seemed to pulse with an inner light, the shadows twisting and writhing with renewed vigor. We reached a large chamber, the tunnel opening up into a vast, circular space. In the center stood a massive stone altar, carved with intricate patterns that mirrored the markings on the walls of the tunnel. Above the altar, a single shaft of moonlight pierced the darkness, illuminating a strange, crystalline structure suspended from the ceiling. It pulsed with a faint, ethereal light, mirroring the rhythm of the humming. The humming reached a crescendo, the air thrumming with power. The crystalline structure began to rotate slowly, emitting beams of light that danced across the chamber walls, illuminating the carvings in a grotesque, flickering display. The ground shook violently, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber. It wasn't a human voice. It was deep, resonant, ancient. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, yet somehow, I understood its meaning. It was a greeting, a welcoming. Alara screamed, dropping the journal. It fell open, landing on a page filled with intricate diagrams and symbols. One symbol in particular caught my eye. It was the same symbol that was carved on the altar, the same symbol that pulsed at the center of the crystalline structure. The voice continued, its tone shifting, becoming more insistent, more demanding. The humming intensified, the vibrations growing stronger. The ground beneath our feet felt as if it were about to liquefy. I picked up the journal, my hands shaking. I turned to the page Alara's grandfather had marked with a faded red ribbon. It was a prayer, or perhaps an incantation, written in the same strange language as the carvings. Beneath it, a handwritten note in Alara's grandfather's shaky script, the silencing ritual. Use it with caution, the mountain must sleep. I looked at Alara, her face pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on the pulsing crystalline structure. The voice continued its relentless chant, the chamber vibrating with its power. The mountain was awake. We have to stop it, I said, my voice trembling. Alara nodded, her eyes filled with a desperate resolve. We knelt before the altar, the journal open between us. The voice echoed around us, its power threatening to overwhelm us. Taking a deep breath, I began to read the incantation aloud, my voice shaky at first, then growing stronger, fueled by a desperate hope. The words felt strange on my tongue, ancient and powerful. As I spoke, the humming seemed to falter, the vibrations lessening. The crystalline structure slowed its rotation, its light dimming. The voice echoed one last time, a mournful wail that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Then, silence. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by our ragged breaths. The air was still, the ground solid beneath our feet. The carvings on the walls seemed to have retreated back into the stone, their shadows still and lifeless. The mountain had fallen silent. But for how long? Part 9. The Resonance of Regret. The glyphs pulsed a sickly yellow, the air thick with the buzzing anticipation of something unseen. Elias traced the lines with a trembling finger, the cold stone radiating a subtle vibration that climbed his arm and settled in his chest, a fluttering hummingbird trapped beneath his ribs. He felt a strange kinship with these forgotten engineers, their ingenuity tinged with a horrifying disregard for the natural order. They had touched something they shouldn't have, unlocked a power best left undisturbed. I think I understand, Elias muttered, his voice hoarse. He looked at Professor Armitage, whose face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. Awe, fear, and a dangerous glimmer of obsession. These aren't blueprints for moving mountains. They're blueprints for something else. Armitage's eyes widened. Else? What else could it possibly be? Think about it, Elias said, his gaze returning to the pulsing glyphs. They learned to manipulate resonant frequencies, to harness the very vibrations of the earth itself. They moved mountains, yes, but what if that was just a byproduct? What if their true goal was to amplify these vibrations, to reach a different kind of resonance? A gust of wind howled through the cavern, extinguishing several of their torches and plunging the chamber into near darkness. The flickering yellow glow of the glyphs became more pronounced, the humming intensifying until it felt like the very ground beneath their feet was thrumming. A resonance with what? Armitage whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing hum. Elias swallowed hard, a chilling premonition crawling up his spine. With something beyond. Something outside our reality. Suddenly, the humming sharpened, becoming a high-pitched whine that grated on their nerves. The glyphs blazed with a blinding white light, forcing them to shield their eyes. The air crackled with energy, the very stones of the chamber seeming to vibrate with an almost unbearable intensity. A voice, ancient and ethereal, echoed through the cavern. It wasn't spoken, not exactly, but rather felt, a vibration that resonated deep within their bones. It was a language of pure resonance, bypassing the ears entirely and speaking directly to the primal parts of their brains. Elias felt a surge of nausea, his mind reeling. The voice was vast, cold, and utterly alien. He understood, with a sickening clarity, that they had opened a door they couldn't close. The ancient civilization hadn't moved mountains, they had called something down from the stars, something that responded to the resonance of the earth. Armitage, however, seemed entranced. His eyes were wide and glazed over, his lips moving silently as if repeating words he couldn't hear. He reached out a trembling hand towards the pulsating glyphs, a beatific smile spreading across his face. It speaks to me, he whispered, his voice awestruck. It understands. It welcomes. Elias grabbed Armitage's arm, trying to pull him back. Professor, no. We don't know what this is. Armitage shook him off, his strength surprising. He stumbled towards the glyphs, drawn in like a moth to a flame. The humming intensified, the light blinding, and a wind whipped through the cavern, carrying with it a strange, metallic scent. The glyphs began to shift, rearranging themselves into new, more complex patterns. The humming deepened, resonating with the very core of Elias's being. He felt a pull, a sensation of being drawn inwards, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around him. He saw a flicker of movement in the periphery of his vision. Something was coalescing within the pulsing light, taking shape amidst the swirling energy. It was vast and shadowy, its form shifting and undulating, defying any attempt to comprehend its true nature. Tendrils of dark energy reached out from its amorphous body, probing the air, tasting the fear that permeated the cavern. Armitage stood before the emerging entity, his arms outstretched, a look of ecstatic surrender on his face. The entity reached out a tendril, a dark, shimmering appendage that seemed to defy the laws of physics, and gently touched his forehead. A high-pitched scream tore through the cavern, but it wasn't from Armitage. It was the sound of the earth itself, groaning in agony as the resonant frequencies reached a fever pitch. Cracks appeared in the stone walls, spreading like spiderwebs across the surface. The very air seemed to crackle and pop, as if reality itself was beginning to unravel. Elias knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was the end. The ancient civilization hadn't just moved mountains, they had invited destruction. They had created a resonance that echoed across the void, drawing the attention of something ancient, something powerful, something hungry. And now, it was here. He turned and ran, the screams of the earth echoing in his ears. The image of Armitage's blissful surrender burned into his memory. He knew he couldn't escape, not really. The resonance had already begun, and it would continue, spreading outwards like ripples in a pond, consuming everything in its path. The ancient civilization's legacy wasn't of ingenuity, but of unimaginable horror. They had touched the face of God, and it had stared back with cold, indifferent eyes. Part 10. The Resonance of Regret. The humming intensified, a deep thrumming that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. We huddled closer to the monolith, the flickering torchlight painting grotesque shadows on its surface. Alara's chant, though wavering, continued, a thin thread of defiance against the rising tide of sonic power. The ground trembled with increasing ferocity. Cracks snaked across the cavern floor, widening with each pulse of sound. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, coating us in a fine layer of grit. The air itself seemed to thicken, vibrating with unseen energy. "It's working," Elias gasped, his voice strained. "The resonance is building." But the look in his eyes wasn't one of triumph. It was fear, pure and unadulterated. He glanced at the monolith, then back at us. A strange mix of desperation and apology etched on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words were drowned out by a low, guttural groan that echoed from the depths of the earth. The groaning grew louder, morphing into a series of rhythmic pulses that hammered against our eardrums. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, primal and unsettling, like the groaning of a colossal beast awakening from an age-long slumber. "What's happening?" I shouted, my voice barely audible above the din. Elias shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. I don't know. The resonance is amplifying, something else. Something ancient." The ground beneath our feet heaved violently. We stumbled, clutching at the monolith for support. The chanting stopped abruptly as Alara cried out, her hand flying to her head. Her eyes rolled back, revealing only white. Then the true horror began. The wall opposite the monolith began to shimmer, as if the very air itself was liquefying. The shimmering intensified, the colors swirling and distorting until it resembled a kaleidoscope of nightmares. Then, with a sickening lurch, the wall seemed to inhale. A vast, gaping maw opened up, swallowing the flickering torchlight and plunging us into near darkness. From the depths of the newly formed chasm, the groaning intensified, accompanied by a chorus of whispers that slithered into our minds like venomous snakes. The whispers were in a language I couldn't comprehend, yet I understood their meaning with chilling clarity. They spoke of ancient gods and forgotten rituals, of sacrifices and cosmic horrors beyond human comprehension. Elias screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound that was quickly swallowed by the oppressive darkness. He scrambled backwards, away from the chasm, his eyes fixed on the swirling vortex of shadow within. "Close it," he shrieked. "Alara, close it." But Alara remained motionless, her body rigid, her eyes still vacant. The whispers intensified, coiling around us, tightening their grip on our sanity. I felt a cold dread seep into my soul, a primal fear that transcended all logic and reason. The chasm pulsed, growing larger with each agonizing groan. From within its depths, something began to emerge. It was vast and amorphous, a swirling mass of shadow and light that defied description. Tendrils of darkness reached out, probing the edges of the chasm, seeking purchase in our reality. I wanted to run, to scream, to hide, but I was paralyzed by terror, rooted to the spot, my gaze fixed on the unfolding horror. The amorphous mass continued to grow, its form shifting and changing, as if it were still coalescing, still finding its shape in our world. The whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of voices that screamed and shrieked inside my head. And then, from the heart of the swirling darkness, 2 points of light emerged. They grew brighter, sharper, until they coalesced into 2 burning eyes, vast and ancient, filled with an unimaginable malice. The eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew. We had unleashed something terrible upon the world. Something that had been slumbering for eons, waiting for the resonant frequencies to awaken it from its ancient prison. Elias was sobbing now, a broken, whimpering sound. He crawled towards me, his hands outstretched. "We were wrong," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of whispers. "We were so wrong." The amorphous mass surged forward, its tendrils reaching, grasping. The whispers intensified, becoming a deafening roar. And as the darkness consumed us, I knew that we had not moved mountains. We had moved something far, far worse. We had moved the very fabric of reality, and in doing so, we had unleashed the ancient horrors that lay dormant within. The resonance of our regret echoed through the cavern, a final, mournful symphony to the end of our world. Part 11. Resonance. The carvings, illuminated by Alara's wavering headlamp, depicted scenes of escalating chaos. Figures, initially serene and stylized, became progressively distorted, their limbs elongated and twisted, their faces masks of silent screams. The final panels showed crumbled cities, fractured landscapes, and a sky filled with swirling, unnatural patterns. A deep, resonant hum, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the cavern floor, a physical manifestation of the dread clinging to the air. This is what happened," Alara whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "They pushed too far." Daniel, his face pale and drawn, traced a finger across the carving of a fractured mountain. "It wasn't just moving mountains, Alara. They were reshaping the very fabric of reality." The humming intensified, subtly shifting in pitch. It seemed to burrow into their bones, a low, persistent thrumming that resonated with something primal within them. Alara felt a growing unease, a sense of being watched, of being measured. They pushed deeper into the cavern, the air growing colder, thicker. The humming was now a constant companion, weaving itself into the silence, a dissonant counterpoint to the drip of water echoing through the vast space. They reached a chamber larger than any they had encountered yet. In the center stood a colossal structure, unlike anything Alara could comprehend. It was a vast, obsidian-like disk, perfectly smooth and polished, reflecting the weak light back in distorted, shimmering waves. It was supported by a complex framework of interwoven bronze rods, each etched with intricate, pulsating symbols. The humming emanated from this disk, radiating outward in palpable waves. What is it? Alara stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the pulsating symbols. I think it's the source. The instrument they used. He reached out a trembling hand, almost touching one of the bronze rods. As his fingers brushed against the cold metal, the humming intensified, the symbols glowing with an eerie, internal light. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Alara grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Daniel, stop. Don't you feel it? Something's wrong. He hesitated, his eyes glazed over, a strange fascination gripping him. But I understand it. I can hear it. The music. A low, guttural chant began to echo from the walls of the chamber, seemingly originating from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a language neither of them recognized, yet it resonated within them, stirring something ancient and forgotten. The humming intensified, becoming a deep, resonant drone that vibrated through the very air they breathed. Alara felt a chilling wave of fear wash over her. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was something alive, something awake. The chants grew louder, the vibrations stronger, the air thick with an oppressive, palpable energy. Daniel, his eyes now completely unfocused, began to move towards the disc again, drawn by an unseen force. He started to hum along with the chanting, his voice a low, guttural echo of the ancient sounds. Daniel, Alara shouted, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him back. Snap out of it. He shrugged her off, his strength surprising. He continued towards the disc, his movements becoming increasingly erratic, almost ritualistic. The symbols on the bronze rods pulsed with blinding light, the obsidian disc humming with an almost unbearable intensity. Alara felt a sharp pain in her head, as if a needle was being driven into her skull. The chanting, the humming, the vibrations, it was all too much. She stumbled back, clutching her head, her vision blurring. She saw Daniel reach the disc, his hand outstretched. He touched one of the glowing symbols, and a blinding flash of light erupted, filling the chamber. Alara screamed, shielding her eyes. The ground shook violently, the cavern walls groaning under immense pressure. The chanting reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. When the light subsided, Daniel was gone. The obsidian disc still hummed, but the intensity had diminished, the symbols now glowing with a dull, pulsating light. The chanting had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the drip of water and the faint, resonant hum of the disc. Alara was alone, surrounded by the echoes of an ancient power she could barely comprehend. And the terrifying realization that whatever had happened to Daniel, it was only the beginning. The vibrations had awakened something, and it was listening. Part 12. The Resonance of Regret. The chanting grew louder, a physical pressure against my eardrums, a tremor in my bones. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was a force, a living entity wrapping itself around us, squeezing the air from our lungs. Alara clutched my arm, her knuckles white, her face pale in the flickering torchlight. The air itself seemed to vibrate, the very stones of the tunnel humming with an unnatural energy. The glyphs on the walls pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, like veins throbbing beneath skin. We need to go back, I yelled, my voice barely audible above the oppressive drone. Alara shook her head, her eyes fixated on the tunnel ahead. No, we're close. I can feel it. Close to what? To madness? To death? The rhythmic chanting, once hypnotic, now felt like a jackhammer against my skull. The further we descended, the more intense it became, the more tangible. It wasn't just the chanting of the unseen choir, it was the resonance of the mountain itself, a deep, guttural hum that seemed to emanate from the earth's core. We reached a vast cavern, the air thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something ancient and indescribably foul. The torchlight revealed towering structures, not carved from the rock, but seemingly grown from it, twisted and organic, pulsating with the same sickly green light as the glyphs. In the center of the cavern, a colossal, obsidian-like spire reached towards the ceiling, its surface etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe before our eyes. The chanting reached a fever pitch here, a cacophony of voices that blended into a single, deafening roar. And then we saw them. Figures, humanoid but grotesquely distorted, clustered around the base of the spire. Their skin was the color of polished granite, their limbs elongated and spindly, their heads disproportionately large, dominated by enormous, vacant eyes that glowed with the same unsettling green light. They moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of the chanting, as if they were puppets controlled by an unseen puppeteer. These weren't the builders, the architects of this impossible place. These were something else, something created. Alara pulled me towards a shadowed alcove, her hand trembling in mine. The Guardians, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The text spoke of them. They protect the heart. The heart? My gaze drifted back to the obsidian spire. Was that it? The source of the sound, the engine of this monstrous symphony? The Guardians began to move in a slow, circular procession around the spire, their chanting intensifying, taking on a new, more urgent quality. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Small rocks tumbled from the ceiling, and fissures appeared in the cavern walls. The mountain itself was reacting to the ritual. Suddenly, one of the Guardians stopped, its huge, vacant eyes locking onto our hiding place. It let out a piercing shriek, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The other Guardians turned, their gaze following the sound, their movements ceasing abruptly. A wave of palpable dread washed over me, cold and suffocating. They had seen us. The Guardians began to advance, their movements no longer graceful but jerky and predatory, their elongated limbs reaching towards us like the grasping claws of some monstrous insect. The chanting shifted again, becoming a guttural growl, a promise of violence. Alara pushed me back into the alcove, her face a mask of terror. "Run!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "I'll distract them." Before I could protest, she lunged out of the shadows, screaming a string of guttural words in the ancient language. The Guardians turned their attention to her, their vacant eyes burning with malevolent intensity. I knew I should run, that I had no chance against these creatures, but I couldn't leave her. I grabbed a loose rock from the floor of the alcove and charged forward, screaming incoherently, a primal scream born of pure, unadulterated fear. The rock struck the nearest Guardian in the head with a sickening thud. It staggered back, its glowing eyes flickering, but it didn't fall. The other Guardians closed in, their chanting rising to a crescendo, the ground shaking violently. Alara was surrounded. She fought back with a desperate ferocity, kicking and scratching, but she was outnumbered, overpowered. The Guardians grabbed her, their long, bony fingers digging into her flesh. She screamed again, a high-pitched wail that cut through the cacophony of chanting, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. I lunged forward again, swinging the rock wildly, but it was too late. The Guardians lifted Alara into the air, their movements eerily synchronized, and carried her towards the obsidian spire. As they reached its base, they threw her towards it, her body impacting the smooth, black surface with a sickening crunch. The chanting stopped. The ground stilled. The air, thick with the smell of ozone and decay, hung heavy and silent. The Guardians stood motionless, their vacant eyes fixed on the spire, as if waiting for something to happen. And then, the spire began to glow. Part 13. The Resonance of Regret. The chanting grew louder, a guttural drone that vibrated through the very bedrock beneath our feet. Dust rained down from the canyon walls, and the air thrummed with a power that felt both ancient and terrifyingly alien. Dr. Ramirez clutched the artifact tighter, his knuckles white. His eyes, usually bright with intellectual curiosity, were now wide and glazed with a strange mix of fear and awe. "It's working," he whispered, his voice hoarse. They're activating it." The ground trembled more violently now, and a low, grinding sound began to echo through the canyon. It was the sound of stone on stone, but on a scale so immense it defied comprehension. I looked up, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw it. The mountain was moving. Not dramatically, not in a sudden, earth-shattering collapse, but slowly, inexorably, as if some unseen hand were pushing it upwards. Cracks spider-webbed across its face, and from deep within its bowels came a deep, resonant hum that seemed to burrow into my very skull. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a visceral awareness of colossal power being unleashed. "We need to get out of here," Elena shouted over the din, her voice strained with panic. "This whole place is going to come down on us." But it was too late. The chanting intensified, and the mountain's ascent quickened. The ground buckled beneath us, throwing us off our feet. I scrambled to my knees, disoriented, my ears ringing with the oppressive resonance. The air was thick with dust, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. Through the haze, I saw Dr. Ramirez still clutching the artifact, his face illuminated by a strange, ethereal glow emanating from the canyon walls. He was chanting along with the unseen choir, his voice a disturbing echo of the ancient power he had unleashed. "Ramirez," I yelled, trying to reach him, but my voice was swallowed by the cacophony. A section of the canyon wall collapsed nearby, sending a cascade of rocks and debris tumbling down towards us. Elena screamed and pulled me back, narrowly avoiding being crushed. We stumbled further into the canyon, the only direction we could go, deeper into the heart of the unfolding catastrophe. The further we went, the more intense the chanting became. It was as though we were being drawn towards its source, pulled by an invisible force. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange energy that made my skin crawl. I felt a growing sense of dread, a primal fear that resonated deep within my bones. Then, through the dust and the echoing chants, I saw it. A vast chamber, carved into the very heart of the mountain. Its walls were covered in intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. In the center of the chamber, bathed in an unearthly glow, was a massive crystal, pulsing with a rhythmic light that matched the tempo of the chanting. Around the crystal stood figures, cloaked and hooded, their faces obscured by shadow. They were the source of the chanting, the conductors of this terrifying symphony of destruction. As I watched, they raised their hands towards the crystal, and the chanting reached a crescendo. The mountain groaned, a sound of unimaginable strain. The ground beneath us heaved, and cracks spread across the chamber floor. I realized then that the mountain wasn't just being moved, it was being transformed, reshaped by the power of the crystal and the chanting. Suddenly, Dr. Ramirez stumbled into the chamber, his eyes still glazed, the artifact clutched tightly in his hand. He moved towards the crystal, drawn by the same unseen force that had pulled us in. He raised the artifact, and as he did, the crystal pulsed with an even brighter light, and the chanting intensified. The mountain shuddered violently, the ground beneath us gave way, and we plunged into darkness. I landed hard, the air knocked out of my lungs. The chanting echoed around me, fainter now, but still present. I struggled to my feet, my head spinning, and tried to orient myself. I was in a narrow passage, the walls smooth and cold. Elena was beside me, groaning in pain. "Ramirez," she whispered, her voice weak. I looked around, but he was nowhere to be seen. He had vanished, swallowed by the earth, along with the artifact and the chanting figures. The resonance of the chanting still vibrated through the rock, a haunting reminder of the power we had witnessed, the power we had unleashed. We were trapped, deep within the bowels of a mountain that was being reshaped by forces beyond our comprehension. And as the echoes of the chanting faded, a new sound began to emerge, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. It was the sound of something ancient, something vast, something waking. And it filled me with a terror unlike anything I had ever known. Part 14. The Resonance of Regret. The flickering lamplight cast grotesque shadows on the cyclopean stones of the chamber, making them seem to shift and breathe. Dr. Aris Thorne shivered, not entirely from the damp chill of the subterranean air. He clutched the translated inscription tighter, the clay tablet cold against his trembling fingers. The words, even now, after weeks of deciphering, sent chills crawling up his spine. They spoke of the Song of Unmaking, a harmonic resonance so powerful it could unravel the very fabric of matter. And worse, they hinted at a failsafe, a counter-resonance designed to silence the song, but one that carried its own terrible consequences. Are you sure about this, Aris? Professor Morales's voice, usually booming with authority, was now thin and strained. He gestured towards the massive, intricately carved basalt structure dominating the chamber. It resembled a giant tuning fork, its two prongs reaching towards the vaulted ceiling. This could be catastrophic. Aris swallowed, his throat dry. We don't have a choice. The tremors are increasing. The song is building. If we don't activate the silencer. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The image of the Andes crumbling, of the earth itself tearing asunder, hung heavy in the air. The inscription detailed a precise sequence of tones, a dissonant melody that would disrupt the song of unmaking. It required activating a series of smaller resonators positioned around the giant tuning fork, each emitting a specific frequency. The process was delicate, fraught with potential for disaster. A single wrong note, a slight miscalibration, could amplify the song instead of silencing it, potentially leading to an unimaginable cataclysm. They worked in tense silence, the only sound the scraping of their boots against the stone floor and the occasional click of a resonator being adjusted. The air grew thick with a palpable energy, a humming tension that made the hairs on the back of Aris's neck stand on end. He could feel the vibrations in his bones, a deep, unsettling pulse that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Finally, all the resonators were in place. Only the central tuning fork remained. Aris hesitated, his hand hovering over the activation lever. He looked at Morales, saw the fear mirrored in his eyes. "Ready?" Aris asked, his voice barely a whisper. Morales nodded, his jaw clenched. "Do it." Aris pulled the lever. A low, guttural hum filled the chamber, growing in intensity with each passing second. The resonators began to glow, emitting a faint, ethereal light. The air thrummed with unseen energy. The vibrations intensified, becoming almost painful. Aris felt a pressure building in his ears, a strange dizziness that made the room spin. Then, a discordant, ear-splitting shriek ripped through the silence. The ground bucked violently. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. The resonators pulsed with a blinding light, the sound building to an unbearable crescendo. Aris clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate his very skull. Suddenly, the shriek cut off. The resonators went dark. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged breaths of Aris and Morales. They stood there for a moment, ears ringing, hearts pounding, waiting for the earth to split open beneath them. But nothing happened. The tremors had stopped. The humming was gone. The silence was, unsettlingly complete. Did it work? Morales croaked, his voice hoarse. Aris wasn't sure. The silence felt wrong, too absolute. He looked around the chamber, his gaze settling on the inscription he still clutched in his hand. He reread the final lines, a sense of dread creeping into his heart. He had focused so intently on silencing the Song of Unmaking that he had overlooked the warning about the silencer itself. The inscription described a side effect, a consequence of disrupting the song. It spoke of a void, a silencing not just of the destructive resonance, but of other, more fundamental vibrations. It warned that the silencer, in its quest to quell the song, would also dampen the very essence of life, leaving behind a stillness. A chilling realization washed over Aris. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the wall. The stone, once vibrating with the energy of the earth, was now cold and inert. He looked at Morales, saw the same dawning horror in his eyes. The silence wasn't the peace they had hoped for. It was the absence of something vital, something essential. The Song of Unmaking had been silenced, but so had something else, the Song of Life itself. They had stopped the mountains from crumbling, but at what cost? The tremors had ceased, but the earth felt dead. The oppressive silence pressed in on them, a suffocating blanket of nothingness. Aris closed his eyes, a single thought echoing in the desolate emptiness of his mind. They had traded one apocalypse for another. And this one, this silent, empty void, might be far worse. Part 15. The Resonance of Regret. The chanting intensified, a physical pressure against my eardrums, vibrating the very marrow in my bones. The glyphs on the obsidian disc pulsated with a sickening, internal light, like the veins of some colossal, subterranean beast. Elena, her face a mask of grim determination, manipulated the tuning forks, her movements precise, almost surgical. Each adjustment sent tremors through the ground, the vibrations growing stronger, more focused. The air itself crackled with an unseen energy. We were deep within the chamber, the resonating chamber, Elena called it. It was a vast, cavernous space, the walls carved with intricate, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering torchlight. The obsidian disc rested on a pedestal of polished bone, surrounded by a circle of smaller, intricately carved stones. The air was thick, heavy, laden with the scent of dust and something ancient, something wrong. Almost, Elena whispered, her voice tight with strain. Just a little more. The chanting reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of guttural sounds that seemed to claw at the edges of sanity. The ground beneath our feet began to heave in earnest now, small cracks appearing in the stone floor. The torches flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows that mimicked the writhing glyphs on the walls. I felt a creeping dread, a primal fear that burrowed deep within my soul. This wasn't just the movement of stone, it was the stirring of something far older, far more powerful. A low hum emanated from the obsidian disc, growing steadily in intensity. The air shimmered around it, distorting the light, creating phantom shapes that danced at the periphery of my vision. The chanting reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. Then, abruptly, it stopped. A silence descended upon the chamber, heavy and oppressive. The air still crackled with residual energy, and the ground continued to tremble, though less violently now. Elena swayed on her feet, her face pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of triumph and terror. "I did it," she whispered. I aligned the frequencies. I looked at the obsidian disc. The hum had ceased, replaced by a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very core of my being. The glyphs on its surface glowed with an eerie, internal light, pulsating slowly, rhythmically. What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely a croak. Elena shook her head, a strand of hair falling across her face. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "The texts, they don't say. They only speak of aligning the frequencies, of unlocking the potential." As if in answer to her words, a low groan echoed through the chamber. It came from deep within the earth, a sound of immense strain, of something vast shifting in its slumber. The ground beneath our feet bucked violently, throwing us to the floor. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and cracks spread across the walls like spider webs. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, scrambling to my feet. Elena nodded, her face ashen. We stumbled towards the entrance to the chamber, the ground heaving beneath us, the air filled with the groaning of the earth. We reached the tunnel, the only escape route, just as a section of the ceiling collapsed behind us, blocking our path back to the chamber. The tunnel itself was shaking violently, threatening to collapse at any moment. As we crawled through the narrow passage, the groaning intensified, accompanied by a series of deep, rhythmic thuds. It sounded like a giant heart beating, slow and ponderous. The thuds resonated through the earth, vibrating through our bones, a physical manifestation of the power we had unleashed. We finally reached the end of the tunnel, emerging into the cold night air. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the desolate landscape. The groaning continued, though fainter now, a constant reminder of the forces we had unleashed. We turned to look back at the mountain. It seemed different. The outline was subtly altered, less defined, as if it were shimmering in the moonlight. But it was the feeling, more than anything, that sent a chill down my spine. The mountain felt alive. And as we stood there, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, the mountain began to hum. A low, resonant hum, the same hum that had emanated from the obsidian disc. The humming grew in intensity, filling the air, vibrating through the ground. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the mountain began to move. Part 16. The Resonance of Regret. The cavern air, thick with the dust of ages and the scent of something ancient and organic, pressed against us. Alara's hand trembled in mine, cold despite the oppressive heat radiating from the walls. The resonant hum, the source of our dread and fascination, pulsed with a sickening rhythm, a heartbeat of the earth itself. We stood on the precipice of something colossal, something terrifyingly beyond our comprehension. Dr. Menzies, his face a mask of morbid fascination, pointed a shaking finger towards the vast chamber that opened before us. The amplifying chamber, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The chamber was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't carved or formed by any natural process, it felt, grown. The walls pulsed with a faint, internal light, the same sickly green as the pulsating glyphs we'd seen etched into the monoliths. The air shimmered with unseen waves of energy, causing the light to distort and dance in hypnotic patterns. At the center of the chamber, dominating the space, was a structure that defied description. It resembled a gigantic, petrified flower, its petals unfurling towards the ceiling, each tipped with a crystalline structure that pulsed with the same rhythmic green light. The hum emanating from it was almost physical, a pressure against our eardrums, a vibration deep within our bones. The transducer, Menzies breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. This is where they focused the sound, amplified it, weaponized it. As we moved closer, the ground began to vibrate more intensely. I felt a nausea rising in my throat, a primal fear gripping my gut. The glyphs on the walls pulsed faster, the hum growing louder, more insistent. Alara clung to me, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice strained. "We shouldn't be here." I knew she was right. This place felt wrong, an affront to nature, a violation of something sacred. Yet, a morbid curiosity, a horrifying need to understand, propelled us forward. We reached the base of the transducer. The crystalline tips of the petals hummed with an almost unbearable intensity, the air shimmering around them. Menzies, oblivious to our fear, pulled a small device from his bag. A geophone, I realized. He knelt, placing it on the ground near one of the crystalline structures. The needle on the device swung wildly, then pinned itself at the maximum reading. "Incredible," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the hum. "The energy output, it's beyond anything we've ever conceived." He looked up at us, his eyes gleaming with a disturbing light. "Imagine," he said, his voice rising with a manic energy. "Imagine the power, the ability to reshape the very landscape, to move mountains, to create, to destroy." He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the pulsating crystal. He reached out, as if drawn by an invisible force, his hand hovering just inches from its surface. "Don't!" Alara screamed. But it was too late. The moment Menzies' fingers brushed against the crystal, the entire chamber erupted in a blinding flash of green light. The hum intensified into a deafening roar, a physical force that slammed us against the cavern wall. I felt a searing pain in my ears, a pressure building in my skull. Alara screamed again, a high-pitched wail lost in the cacophony. Then, as suddenly as it began, the roar subsided. The blinding light faded, replaced by the sickly green glow. The hum returned to its previous rhythm, though it seemed deeper, more resonant. Menzies lay sprawled on the ground, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. He didn't move. I scrambled to my feet, my ears ringing, my head throbbing. Alara lay beside me, dazed but conscious. We looked at each other, our eyes wide with horror. Something had changed. The air felt thicker, heavier. The hum resonated with a new depth, a new malice. Then, we felt it. A tremor. At first, it was subtle, a barely perceptible vibration in the ground. But it grew quickly, intensifying with each passing second. The walls of the cavern began to groan, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. Alara grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh. "We have to get out of here," she screamed over the rising roar of the earth. But we were too late. The chamber was shaking violently now, the ground beneath our feet heaving like a ship in a storm. Cracks snaked across the walls, widening with each tremor. The transducer, the monstrous petrified flower, pulsed with a malevolent green light, the source of the growing cataclysm. And in that moment, I understood. Menzies hadn't just activated the transducer. He had awakened something. Something ancient, something powerful, something angry. We had unleashed the resonance of regret, the echo of a forgotten civilization's terrible power, and now, we were about to face its consequences. The floor beneath us gave way. We fell into darkness. The chasm yawned, a jagged tear in the earth, revealing layers of rock striated with colors unseen in natural formations. The air itself shimmered with a low, almost inaudible hum, a vibration that burrowed deep into our bones. Elias, pale and shaking, clutched the fragmented clay tablet, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. This is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the subterranean drone. The resonant heart. We stood on the precipice, peering into the abyss. The torches we carried flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the uneven walls of the chasm. The air grew colder, thicker, and tasted metallic, like blood. The hum intensified, a physical pressure against our eardrums, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with our own heartbeats, then slowly, insidiously, begin to overtake them. "What do we do now?" A tremor in Lena's voice betrayed her fear. She gripped my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh. I wished I had a comforting answer, a plan, anything other than the sickening dread that was slowly consuming me. Elias, seemingly oblivious to our apprehension, knelt at the edge of the chasm, tracing the symbols on the tablet with a trembling finger. He muttered something under his breath, a string of guttural sounds that seemed to echo the resonant hum emanating from the depths. "The tablet, it speaks of a final chord," he said, his voice strained. "A sequence of tones that will unlock something." He looked up at us, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. "We have to play it." "Play it?" I repeated incredulously. "Play what? We don't have any instruments." Elias gestured to the chasm. "The resonant heart. It's the instrument," he explained, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. How the ancient civilization had carved this vast chasm, shaping the very rock formations to act as a colossal resonating chamber. The specific arrangement of the walls, the tunnels that spiraled downwards, the minerals embedded in the stone, all were meticulously designed to amplify and manipulate sound waves. The clay tablet wasn't a map, he realized now, but a musical score. The idea was insane, terrifying. To unleash sounds of such power, in a place so obviously saturated with an ancient, unknown energy, felt like inviting catastrophe. But the hum from the chasm was growing louder, more insistent, as though urging us on. And Elias, consumed by his obsession, seemed determined to proceed, regardless of the consequences. We spent the next few hours, which felt like an eternity, deciphering the symbols on the tablet. They weren't notes in any musical notation we recognized, but rather complex geometrical patterns, each representing a specific frequency or resonance. Elias, guided by a feverish intuition, began to translate these patterns into a series of vocalizations, a strange, discordant melody that sent shivers down my spine. As the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the chasm, we were ready. Elias positioned himself at the edge, facing the abyss. Lena and I stood behind him, holding our breath, our hearts pounding in unison with the resonant hum. He began to sing. The sound that emerged from his lips was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was deep, guttural, otherworldly. It resonated with the hum of the chasm, amplifying it, twisting it into something new, something powerful and terrifying. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Dust and small stones rained down from the walls of the chasm. The air crackled with an unseen energy. As Elias continued, the sounds grew in intensity. The single voice became a chorus, echoing and reverberating within the vast chamber. The chasm seemed to breathe, the walls pulsing with an eerie luminescence. The resonant hum transformed into a deafening roar, a cacophony of sound that threatened to tear us apart. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. The air hung heavy, still vibrating with the aftershocks of the sound. We stood there, frozen, waiting. For what, I didn't know. Then, from the depths of the chasm, a new sound emerged. It was not a hum, nor a roar, but a whisper. A low, sibilant whisper that seemed to slither into our minds, wrapping itself around our thoughts. It spoke in a language we couldn't understand, yet somehow, we understood. It spoke of power, of ancient knowledge, of a world reshaped by sound. It spoke of beings beyond our comprehension, beings that slumbered in the earth, waiting to be awakened. And then, the whisper changed. It became a command to listen, to learn, to obey. Elias, his eyes glazed over, his body swaying, took a step forward. Towards the chasm, towards the whisper. Elias, Lena screamed, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The ground beneath his feet gave way. He plunged into the darkness, his scream swallowed by the resonant heart. Lena and I stood there, paralyzed with horror, staring into the abyss. The whisper continued, its insidious tendrils reaching out, seeking purchase in our minds. We were alone, trapped at the edge of the world, with a power we couldn't comprehend, a power that had already claimed one of our own. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wouldn't be long before it claimed us too. The resonating hum, once a distant thrum, now vibrated through Alina's very bones. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, the ground beneath her feet shuddering in time with the pulsing rhythm. Above, the monstrous, reconstituted form of Aconcagua writhed against the bruised twilight sky. It wasn't just a mountain anymore, it was a grotesque parody of nature, a monument to a forgotten, terrible power. The refugees huddled closer, their faces masks of fear etched with the flickering light of the burning pyres. Even the normally stoic Kai seemed shaken, his hand gripping the obsidian shard like a lifeline. He glanced at Alina, his eyes mirroring the unearthly glow emanating from the mountain. "It's almost complete," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the resonating hum. "The ritual is nearing its culmination." Alina swallowed, her throat dry. The culmination. What did that even mean? What horrific act were the echoes preparing? The fragmented whispers she'd gleaned from the glyphs spoke of a reshaping, a reordering of the world. A world built on the pulverized remains of the old. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The resonating hum intensified, becoming a physical force pressing against her chest, stealing her breath. She stumbled, catching herself on a nearby rock. The obsidian pendant around her neck throbbed in sync with the resonating sound, a burning sensation spreading through her chest. Suddenly, the ground lurched violently. A deep groan echoed from the earth, as if the planet itself were crying out in pain. Fissures snaked across the ground, glowing with a malevolent red light. The refugees screamed, scrambling for purchase on the shifting terrain. Alina saw Kai struggling to keep his footing, his obsidian shard slipping from his grasp. She lunged forward, grabbing his arm just as the ground beneath him gave way. She pulled him back, her muscles straining with the effort. He landed heavily beside her, his face pale. "Thank you," he gasped, retrieving the shard. He looked back at the gaping fissure, its depths pulsing with the same red light as the mountain. "They're opening the way." "The way to where?" Alina asked, her voice trembling. Kai's gaze was fixed on Aconcagua, his expression grim. "To the heart of the earth. To the source of their power." The humming reached a fever pitch, the very air seeming to vibrate. Then, with a deafening crack that split the sky, the summit of Aconcagua erupted in a blinding flash of light. A pillar of raw energy shot skyward, piercing the clouds and painting the heavens with swirling, incandescent patterns. The earth bucked and heaved, throwing Alina and the others to the ground. When the light subsided, a gaping maw had opened atop the mountain, a swirling vortex of darkness against the remnants of the sunset. The humming transformed into a deep, rhythmic throb, emanating from the vortex, pulling everything towards it. Alina felt a terrifying pull, an irresistible force dragging her towards the gaping maw. She clawed at the ground, desperately trying to hold on, but the pull was too strong. She saw the other refugees, their faces contorted in terror, being dragged towards the vortex, their screams swallowed by the throbbing darkness. Kai grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He anchored himself against a large boulder, fighting against the relentless pull. His eyes met hers, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "We can't let them win," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the thundering roar of the vortex. "We have to stop them." He gestured with his chin towards the obsidian shard in his hand. The glyphs. They spoke of a counter-frequency. A way to disrupt their resonance. He held out the shard to Alina. "You have the pendant. It resonates with the mountain. Combine them. Focus your will. Disrupt the resonance." Alina took the shard, her hand trembling. She understood. The pendant was a key, the shard a catalyst. Together, they could potentially create a counter-frequency, a disruptive force that might break the echo's control. But the pull was intensifying, tearing at her, ripping her away from Kai. She closed her eyes, focusing all her will, all her fear, all her hope, into the pendant and the shard. She imagined the sound, the counter-frequency, a wave of pure disruptive energy washing over the mountain, silencing the resonating hum, closing the gaping maw. She opened her eyes and screamed, a primal scream born of desperation and defiance. The obsidian shard in her hand pulsed with a blinding white light, the pendant around her neck echoing the light, the two objects resonating together, building, intensifying. A wave of energy erupted outwards, crashing against the relentless pull of the vortex. The earth trembled, the air crackled, the humming faltered, and for a brief, precious moment, hope flickered in the darkness. But the mountain roared back. The glyphs pulsed, a sickly, organic green, mirroring the swirling vortex above the ziggurat. Alara, her face smeared with dust and grime, pressed herself against the cold stone wall, the vibrations rumbling through her bones. Around her, the remaining team, just 4 of them now, including Marcus, whose arm hung limp and useless, huddled in similar states of terrified awe. "It's growing," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse. The vortex, once a shimmering disk, now dominated the sky, an emerald eye staring down at them. The air thrummed with a low, guttural hum that resonated deep within their chests. The ground trembled, and small stones skittered across the ziggurat's surface. "We need to get out of here," Alara said, her voice barely audible above the rising din. But where could they go? The jungle, once a refuge, now pulsed with an unseen energy, the trees swaying in a silent, unnatural dance. The very air felt charged, alive. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the hum. It was a sound unlike anything they had ever heard, a sound that seemed to claw at the edges of sanity. One of the team, a young geologist named Ben, clutched at his ears, his eyes wide with terror. "Make it stop," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Please, make it stop." Alara looked at him, pity warring with fear in her heart. She knew the sound was affecting them all, burrowing into their minds, loosening their grip on reality. She'd read enough about the ancient civilization to understand they weren't just moving mountains. They were manipulating something far more fundamental, the fabric of reality itself. The green light intensified, bathing the ziggurat in its eerie glow. The hum deepened, morphing into a rhythmic pulse that seemed to synchronize with their heartbeats. Alara felt a strange pull, a compulsion to move towards the vortex, to become one with the swirling green energy. She fought against it, digging her fingernails into the stone. She had to stay grounded, had to hold onto her sanity. She looked at Marcus, his face pale and drawn. He seemed to be experiencing the same pull, his eyes fixed on the vortex with a morbid fascination. "Marcus," she shouted, shaking him. "Don't look at it. Focus on something else." He blinked, his eyes momentarily clearing. The glyphs," he stammered, gesturing weakly towards the wall. Alara followed his gaze. The glyphs were still pulsing, but now they seemed to be shifting, rearranging themselves into new patterns. She squinted, trying to decipher the meaning. Could they hold the key to stopping this? As she studied the glyphs, a horrifying realization dawned on her. They weren't random, they were forming a sequence, a series of resonating frequencies. And the vortex above, it wasn't just a visual phenomenon. It was a manifestation of sound, a symphony of destruction orchestrated by an ancient, unimaginable power. "They're not just moving mountains," she whispered, a chill running down her spine. They're unraveling the world." Just then, the ground lurched violently. The ziggurat, once a solid structure, began to crumble around them. Ben, lost in the throes of the sonic assault, stumbled and fell, disappearing over the edge of the platform. His scream was swallowed by the rising cacophony. Alara and the remaining 2 team members scrambled to their feet, desperately trying to maintain their balance. The ziggurat was disintegrating, piece by piece, pulled apart by the invisible forces unleashed by the vortex. The glyphs on the wall reached a final configuration. The pulsing green light reached a blinding crescendo, and the vortex above exploded outwards, sending a shockwave of pure energy rippling through the jungle. The earth heaved, the sky roared, and the very air seemed to crackle with unseen power. Alara closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. She thought of her family, of the world she was leaving behind. And then, she heard it, a new sound, superimposed over the chaos. A low, resonant hum, different from the one emanating from the vortex. It was a deep, guttural sound, almost organic. She opened her eyes. The ziggurat was gone, reduced to rubble. The jungle, once vibrant and alive, now lay flattened and scorched. And in the center of the devastation, where the vortex had been, stood something new. Something alive. It was a colossal figure, formed from the very earth itself, its body a swirling mass of rock and vegetation, its eyes burning with the same emerald green light as the vortex. It pulsed and throbbed with an internal energy, the low hum emanating from its very core. Alara stared at it, her mind reeling. The ancient civilization hadn't just moved mountains. They had created something monstrous. And as the colossal figure turned its gaze towards the remnants of her team, she knew, with a chilling certainty, that their nightmare had only just begun. Part 20. The Resonance of Regret. The cavern pulsed, a rhythmic throb that vibrated through us, not through the air, but through the very bones of the earth. The glyphs, illuminated by Alara's flickering torch, seemed to writhe, their intricate carvings shifting and blurring at the edges of our vision. The air tasted of ozone, sharp and metallic. We were deep inside the belly of the beast, at the heart of the sound machine the Incas had built. "It's not working," whispered Thomas, his voice strained, echoing oddly in the vast chamber. He gestured to the central platform, where the resonating rods lay inert. They were obsidian, polished smooth as glass, arranged in a complex spiral. Earlier, they had hummed with latent power, but now, they were silent, lifeless. Alara shook her head, her eyes wide with a desperate sort of hope. "It has to. It's our only chance." She knelt by the platform, running her fingers over the cool obsidian. The vibrations, they're faint, almost imperceptible. Something's blocking the flow. I stepped closer, the ground beneath my feet humming with a low, almost sub-audible drone. The glyphs on the walls seemed to pulse in time with it, a silent, mesmerizing dance. A chill ran down my spine. This place felt wrong, as if the very stone itself was rejecting us. "There," I said, pointing to a section of the wall where the glyphs were different. Instead of the flowing, organic lines of the others, these were sharp, angular, almost violent. They radiated an oppressive aura, a sense of wrongness that permeated the air around them. They feel different." Alara followed my gaze. "Dissonance," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "They're creating a counter-frequency, disrupting the flow of the resonance." Can we stop it?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with fear. The rhythmic pulsing of the cavern seemed to be intensifying, pressing in on us, squeezing the air from our lungs. Alara studied the glyphs, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Maybe, if we can understand the pattern, we might be able to neutralize it." She pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from her pack, flipping through its pages until she found a diagram similar to the glyphs on the wall. As she worked, the pulsing grew stronger, the air thick with anticipation. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, the tremors growing in intensity. Small rocks fell from the ceiling, clattering against the stone floor. The silence between the pulses stretched, thin and taut, filled with a palpable sense of dread. "Almost," Alara muttered, her voice barely audible above the growing rumble. She traced her finger along the diagram, her lips moving silently as she deciphered the complex patterns. The glyphs on the wall seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in response to her touch. Suddenly, a deep, resonating hum filled the cavern, emanating from the central platform. The obsidian rods vibrated, glowing with an eerie, internal light. The ground shook violently, throwing us to our knees. The glyphs on the walls blazed with power, their light blinding. "It's working," Thomas shouted, his voice barely audible above the deafening roar. But there was no triumph in his tone, only fear. The resonance, once a subtle hum, had become a cacophony, a deafening roar that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. The ground heaved, the walls groaned. Deep fissures snaked across the floor, widening with each pulse of the resonating rods. The air shimmered and distorted, the boundaries between reality and something else blurring, dissolving. Alara scrambled to her feet, her face pale with terror. "We have to stop it. It's too much." She reached for the platform, her hand outstretched towards the pulsing obsidian rods. But it was too late. The cavern exploded in a blinding flash of light and sound. The ground beneath us dissolved, swallowing us into a vortex of swirling chaos. The last thing I saw, before darkness consumed me, was the horrified expression on Alara's face, and the triumphant glow of the glyphs, burning bright against the collapsing walls of the cavern. The resonance, amplified beyond control, was tearing the world apart, and we, caught in its destructive embrace, were going down with it. We had sought to control the power of the ancients, but in the end, it was the power that controlled us. And the mountains, they did not move. They shattered. What if ancient civilizations used sound to move mountains? Part 21. The resonating hum permeated everything. It vibrated in my teeth, a phantom limb thrumming in the hollow where my arm used to be. Alara, pale and gaunt, clutched a fistful of dirt, her eyes fixed on the shifting landscape. The mountain, or what was left of it, pulsed like a diseased heart, its rocky skin rippling and folding in on itself. The resonant frequencies, amplified by the unearthed monoliths, were tearing it apart at the molecular level. "It's changing the very fabric of reality," Alara whispered, her voice barely audible above the low, guttural moan of the earth. This isn't just moving mountains. This is unmaking them." The air crackled with an unseen energy. The ground beneath our feet, once solid and reassuring, now felt treacherous, as if it might dissolve at any moment. The sky, a sickly yellow-green, swirled with dust and debris, obscuring the setting sun. We stumbled back, seeking refuge behind a jagged outcropping of rock, the only semblance of stability in this chaotic landscape. I glanced at the device in Alara's hand, the resonating orb pulsing with an eerie, internal light. It was the key, the trigger to this apocalyptic symphony. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that we were past the point of no return. "We have to stop it," I said, my voice strained. Alara shook her head, her gaze distant, haunted. "Too late. The resonance has reached a critical point. It's self-sustaining now." A tremor, more violent than any before, ripped through the ground, throwing us to our knees. The outcropping above us groaned and fractured, sending a cascade of rocks tumbling down. We scrambled away just as a massive fissure opened in the earth, a gaping maw swallowing everything in its path. The humming intensified, evolving into a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to synchronize with our very heartbeats. The landscape continued to warp and distort, the familiar contours of the mountains dissolving into a surreal, ever-shifting panorama. The air shimmered, revealing glimpses of something else. Something beyond our comprehension. Flickering, distorted images of impossible geometries and alien landscapes flashed before our eyes, like glimpses into a broken kaleidoscope. "They weren't moving mountains," Alara murmured, her eyes wide with a terrifying understanding. "They were opening doorways." The realization hit me like a physical blow. These ancient civilizations, masters of sound and vibration, hadn't simply been reshaping the physical world. They were manipulating the very fabric of reality, tearing holes in the space-time continuum, opening gateways to where? Or to when? Another, even more powerful tremor shook the earth, sending a wave of nausea rolling over me. The humming reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that drowned out all other sounds. The flickering images in the air solidified, coalescing into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. It hung in the air before us, a gaping wound in the fabric of reality, pulsing with an alien energy. Fear, raw and primal, gripped me. I wanted to run, to hide, to escape this unfolding nightmare. But there was nowhere to run. We were trapped, caught in the epicenter of this cosmic unraveling. Alara, her face etched with a strange mixture of terror and fascination, reached out towards the vortex. "No," I shouted, grabbing her arm. "Don't touch it," but it was too late. Her hand passed through the shimmering surface, disappearing into the swirling abyss. A jolt of energy arced through her body, throwing her back against the rocks. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and a low, guttural chanting began to emanate from her lips, a language ancient and alien. The vortex expanded, its edges rippling and distorting the very air around it. The chanting grew louder, resonating with the humming of the monoliths, creating a symphony of chaos that threatened to tear the world apart. The ground beneath us began to crumble, the fissure widening, pulling us towards the gaping maw. I looked at Alara, her body convulsing, her voice echoing with the unearthly chant. She was no longer herself. Something else was speaking through her, something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting for millennia to be unleashed. The vortex pulsed, beckoning. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was the end. Not just the end of us, but perhaps the end of everything. The ancient civilizations, in their quest to move mountains, had unleashed something far more terrifying, something they could no longer control. And now, we were all about to pay the price. The ground gave way. I felt myself falling, tumbling into the swirling abyss. The chanting echoing in my ears, the last sound I would ever hear. The resonating hum, it was becoming something else. Part 22. The Resonance of Ruin. The wind whispered through the skeletal remains of the city, a mournful sigh echoing the dirge resonating from deep within the earth. The vibrations had grown more intense, a constant tremor that set my teeth on edge. Even the air itself seemed to thrum, a palpable tension that stretched taut across the desolate landscape. Elena, pale and drawn, clutched the fragmented clay tablet, her eyes fixed on the monstrous cigarette that dominated the horizon. The pulsating red glow emanating from its apex had intensified, a malevolent heartbeat in the dying light. We had discovered more chambers beneath the city, each filled with elaborate carvings depicting scenes of sonic manipulation, of mountains levitating and landscapes reshaped by unseen forces. But one chamber, deeper than the rest, held a different kind of horror. It depicted not the creation, but the destruction. Mountains crumbling into dust, cities swallowed by the earth, the very fabric of reality tearing apart under the strain of the resonant frequencies. It was a warning, etched in stone, of the cataclysmic power they wielded and ultimately, the price they paid. It wasn't just about building, Elena whispered, her voice hoarse. It was about control, control over the very earth itself. But they lost it. The resonant hum intensified, and a low growl rumbled beneath our feet. The ground began to crack, fissures snaking across the barren land like jagged lightning strikes. The ziggurat pulsed, the red glow now a throbbing inferno. We knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever they had unleashed was about to be unleashed again. We stumbled back, the ground heaving beneath us. The fragmented tablet in Elena's hand vibrated violently, the symbols etched upon it glowing with an eerie, internal light. She looked at it, then at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and understanding. This isn't just a record. It's a key, she said, her voice barely a whisper above the growing cacophony. Before I could ask her what she meant, the ground lurched violently, throwing us to the ground. The cracks widened, spewing forth a noxious, sulfurous gas that stung our eyes and throats. The air crackled with energy, and the very sky seemed to twist and distort. The resonant hum escalated into a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to penetrate every cell in our bodies, shaking us to our core. From the heart of the ziggurat, a beam of pure red energy erupted into the sky. It pulsed and throbbed, reaching towards the heavens like a bloody finger accusing the gods themselves. The ground beneath us buckled and heaved, and we clung desperately to the fractured earth as the world around us began to disintegrate. The city, already in ruins, began to collapse in on itself. Buildings crumbled into dust, swallowed by the widening fissures. The very air shimmered and distorted, as if reality itself was beginning to unravel. The resonant roar intensified, a physical force that pressed against us, threatening to crush us beneath its immense power. Then, a voice. Not a human voice, but something ancient, something vast and unknowable. It echoed through the ruins, a voice that spoke not in words, but in the very vibrations that were tearing the world apart. It was a voice of power, of rage, and of unimaginable sorrow. Elena screamed, clutching her ears, her face contorted in agony. The tablet in her hand glowed with an almost blinding intensity, the symbols writhing and shifting like living things. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a terrible understanding. They didn't lose control, she gasped, her voice barely audible above the deafening roar. They directed it. They aimed it. Her words trailed off, lost in the escalating chaos. But I understood. They hadn't lost control of the resonant frequencies. They had weaponized them. This wasn't an accident. This was an act of self-destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. They had chosen annihilation over whatever horror they faced. The red beam from the ziggurat intensified, reaching further and further into the sky. The ground beneath us began to liquefy, and we slid towards a gaping chasm that opened up before us, revealing the churning, molten heart of the earth. The resonant roar reached its crescendo, a deafening blast of pure sonic energy that ripped through the air, tearing the very fabric of reality. And then, silence. A terrible, absolute silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant crackle of the dying fires. The red beam faded, the ziggurat crumbled, and the world around us lay in ruins. We were left, clinging precariously to the edge of oblivion, staring into the abyss, the only survivors of a cataclysm millennia in the making. The resonance of ruin echoed in our souls, a chilling testament to the terrifying power that ancient civilizations had wielded, and the devastating price they had paid. And in the silence, I knew, something else had been awakened. Something that had been waiting, patiently, for millennia. Something far older, and far more terrible, than anything we could have possibly imagined. Part 23. The Resonance of Ruin. The echoing hum had deepened, a physical pressure against my eardrums, vibrating through the very marrow of my bones. The air itself seemed thick, viscous, resisting our desperate scramble up the crumbling steps of the ziggurat. Elena, her face pale and streaked with grime, stumbled, her hand slipping from the cracked stone. I hauled her up, my own strength waning, the oppressive sound draining us like a psychic leech. Above, the crimson sky pulsed in time with the low-frequency drone. The swirling vortex, now a gaping maw in the heavens, seemed to suck the color from the world, leaving behind a monochromatic nightmare. And within that swirling void, something shifted. Something vast. It's coming through, I choked out, the words barely audible above the resonating hum. Elena nodded, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed a trembling finger towards the peak of the ziggurat, where the remaining stones vibrated with an almost unbearable intensity. The air crackled with a strange, static energy, the hair on my arms standing on end. The apex stone, she whispered, her voice hoarse. The focal point. The apex stone, the final piece of the sonic puzzle, the conduit through which the ancients channeled their unimaginable power. We had learned so much in those harrowing weeks, piecing together fragments of knowledge from crumbling tablets and half-buried cities. We understood, finally, the horrifying truth behind the legends, the reason why civilizations rose and fell with terrifying rapidity. They hadn't merely moved mountains, they had moved dimensions. And now, we were about to witness the consequences. As we reached the summit, the ground trembled violently. The apex stone, a massive, obsidian obelisk, glowed with an inner fire, pulsating rhythmically with the deepening hum. The vortex above churned, and a shape began to coalesce within its crimson depths. It wasn't a solid form, not at first. More like a distortion, a ripple in the fabric of reality. Then, slowly, agonizingly, details began to emerge. Tentacles, vast and writhing, the color of dried blood, reached down from the vortex, probing, searching. They were followed by a mass of pulsating flesh, a grotesque parody of a body, covered in shimmering, iridescent scales. No discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, just a gaping, amorphous horror that defied comprehension. The hum reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that seemed to tear at the very threads of existence. The ground beneath us buckled and heaved. Elena screamed, a high-pitched wail swallowed by the all-encompassing sound. The apex stone pulsed one last time, a blinding flash of white light, and then, silence. The sudden absence of sound was more jarring than the noise itself. A ringing silence that pressed against my eardrums, a void that sucked the air from my lungs. I staggered, my knees buckling, the world tilting around me. Slowly, tentatively, I opened my eyes. The vortex was gone. The crimson sky had faded, leaving behind a bruised, twilight hue. The apex stone, still radiating a faint warmth, stood silent and inert. And before us, where moments before there had been nothing but swirling chaos, stood a city. Not a city built of stone and steel, but a city of flesh and bone. A grotesque, organic metropolis, pulsating with a sickly, internal light. Structures that resembled colossal, distended organs rose from the earth, connected by a network of pulsing veins and arteries. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a cloying sweetness that burned the nostrils. Elena whimpered beside me, her hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes fixed on the horrifying spectacle. We were too late," she whispered, her voice choked with despair. I could only nod, my stomach churning. The ancients hadn't merely opened a portal, they had invited something in. Something monstrous, something beyond our comprehension. And now, it had made its home here, in our world. A wave of nausea washed over me, the oppressive silence broken only by the soft, wet sounds emanating from the fleshy city. Sounds that spoke of movement, of life, of something vast and hungry awakening. We had stopped the resonance, but we had unleashed something far worse. The silence was a lie, a prelude to a symphony of horrors yet to come. The mountains had been moved, the dimensions breached, and now, the earth itself would resonate with the echoes of our failure. The final act was about to begin. To be continued, in part 24 of 25. Part 24. The Resonance of the Void. The humming deepened, vibrating the very marrow in our bones. The glyphs on the obsidian platform pulsed with an internal luminescence, a sickening green that stained the air. Around us, the cyclopean stones of the city quivered, their colossal shadows stretching and contracting like grasping claws. Elena clung to my arm, her face ashen. It's happening, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing drone. They're waking it. We were trapped. The obsidian platform had risen, severing our escape route. The chanting, which had been a disjointed murmur only moments ago, coalesced into a unified, terrifying chorus. It felt less like sound and more like a physical force, pressing against our eardrums, our lungs, our very consciousness. The ground began to tremble with increasing ferocity. I risked a glance at the valley below. The swirling mist had dissipated, revealing the true horror of what the ancients had wrought. The valley floor wasn't simply cracked, it was a gaping maw, a chasm of impossible depth stretching down into the earth's bowels. And from that abyss, something was rising. It wasn't a physical entity, not at first. It was a sensation, a wave of pure dread washing over us, colder than the Arctic wind, sharper than any blade. Then, slowly, agonizingly, a shape began to coalesce within the chasm. It wasn't solid, more like a distortion of the air itself, a shimmering mirage of impossible angles and shifting planes. It pulsed with the same sickly green light as the glyphs, casting an eerie glow on the horrified faces of the cultists below. The chanting intensified, the resonance growing unbearable. I felt my teeth begin to ache, a deep, throbbing pain that spread through my jaw and into my skull. Elena cried out, clutching her head. The obsidian platform vibrated so violently that we could barely stand. It felt as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. It's the void, Elena gasped, her voice choked with terror. They're opening a door to the void. I didn't understand what she meant, but the primal fear in her eyes told me it was something beyond human comprehension, something that should remain forever locked away. The shimmering form in the chasm grew larger, its edges becoming more defined. It was a vortex, a swirling mass of nothingness, and from its depths emanated a silence so profound it felt like a physical blow. This silence was more terrifying than the cacophony of the chanting, more disturbing than the earth-shattering resonance. It was the silence of oblivion. The cultists below prostrated themselves before the vortex, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. Their bodies convulsed, their limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Some began to bleed from their eyes and ears, their faces contorted in expressions of ecstatic agony. They were being consumed, not by a physical force, but by the sheer immensity of the void, by the nothingness that lay at the heart of creation. Elena grabbed my hand, her grip like iron. "We have to stop them," she screamed, her voice barely audible above the din. "We have to close the gate." But how? We were trapped, helpless witnesses to the unfolding apocalypse. The obsidian platform continued to vibrate, the glyphs pulsing with a malevolent energy. The vortex in the chasm grew larger, its edges reaching towards the sky, threatening to swallow the entire world. Then, in a flash of inspiration, I remembered the tuning fork. The device Professor Armitage had entrusted to me, the device he believed could counteract the resonance of the ancient machines. I fumbled in my bag, my fingers trembling, and pulled out the small, silver instrument. It was cold to the touch, vibrating faintly with a power I couldn't comprehend. "What is that?" Elena asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaky. "But it might be our only chance." I struck the tuning fork against the obsidian platform. A clear, high-pitched tone rang out, cutting through the oppressive drone of the chanting. The glyphs on the platform flickered, their green glow dimming momentarily. The vortex in the chasm seemed to hesitate, its swirling motion faltering. The cultists below looked up, their faces contorted in rage and confusion. The chanting faltered, breaking into disjointed cries of alarm. I struck the tuning fork again, holding the vibrating prongs towards the chasm. The clear tone resonated through the air, clashing with the deep, guttural hum of the ancient machines. The ground beneath us shook violently. The obsidian platform began to crack, fissures spreading across its surface like lightning bolts. The vortex in the chasm pulsed erratically, its edges fraying, its form dissolving. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't the silence of oblivion. It was the silence of hope, the silence of a battle narrowly won. But was it truly won? The final part of the story held the chilling answer. The resonating hum deepened, a physical pressure against my eardrums, a vibration that seemed to burrow into my bones. The chasm, the very air itself, pulsed with an unseen energy. I clutched Alara's hand, her skin cold and clammy. Around us, the carvings on the chasm walls seemed to writhe, their grotesque forms shifting and blurring in the flickering torchlight. The ground beneath us trembled, not with the violence of an earthquake, but with a slow, deliberate undulation, like the breathing of some colossal beast. Then, the silence. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical blow. The ringing in my ears, the phantom vibrations in my bones, were the only remnants of the resonance that had filled the chasm moments before. The torches sputtered, their flames shrinking, as if the very air was being sucked away. Alara's grip tightened on my hand, her eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the frantic pounding of my heart. I shook my head, unable to speak. I didn't know. Had the ritual failed? Or had something far more terrible occurred? Then, from the depths of the chasm, a new sound arose. Not the resonant hum, but a low, guttural groan. It grew in intensity, morphing into a series of rasping clicks and pops, like the grinding of colossal bones. The ground beneath us began to shake again, this time with increasing violence. Cracks appeared in the chasm walls, spreading like spiderwebs across the ancient carvings. "We have to get out of here," I shouted, my voice strained. We turned to flee, but the path back was blocked. A massive slab of rock, dislodged by the tremors, had sealed the entrance to the tunnel. We were trapped. The groaning intensified, accompanied by a sickening stench, a miasma of decay and ancient dust. From the shadows at the bottom of the chasm, something began to rise. It was immense, a towering, amorphous shape that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Its surface shimmered and shifted, a tapestry of darkness and shadow, punctuated by glimpses of something vast and monstrous within. Alara screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the chasm. I pulled her close, trying to shield her from the sight of the thing that was rising from the depths. But there was nowhere to hide. As the monstrous form ascended, the carvings on the walls seemed to come alive. The grotesque figures writhed and contorted, their eyes burning with an unholy light. They reached out with clawed hands, their mouths opening in silent screams of agony and ecstasy. The very stone seemed to weep, a viscous, black fluid oozing from the cracks in the walls. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The stench intensified, filling my nostrils with the cloying sweetness of decay. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a primal fear gripping my heart. The monstrous form finally reached the top of the chasm, its sheer size dwarfing everything around us. It was not a single entity, but a conglomeration of writhing, pulsating flesh, interwoven with stone and shadow. Its surface was covered in a multitude of eyes, each one burning with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. They fixed on us, their gaze cold and calculating. I knew then, with a chilling certainty, that the ancient civilizations hadn't just moved mountains with sound. They had imprisoned something within them, something vast and terrible, something that should have remained forever locked away.